everybody, and welcome to episode 80 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jodi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of AutoTrader.
And I am Dan Alika, and I am AutoTrader's road test editor, who was caught off guard by your declaration of 80.
Wait till we hit 100.
Oh my Lord!
Bam, 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 bam! That's what I'm planning. Air horn.
Chris, give me a second. I'm addressing our extraordinary producer, Chris. If we don't have like little confetti cannons and all that stuff going off, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed. That would be really cool, just to like
big celebration.
Yeah. Anyways, in the meantime, for the next 20 episodes, we're going to be a little more reserved. And this might be, the most reserved topic we've ever done, but such an important one.
Such an important one because honestly, people ask us this all the time.
Yeah.
And we have a couple articles about this, and they're consistently our top performing articles because this is like one of those burning questions that literally every car buyer has. Whether you are a car person or new to it, everyone has this question. And that question is lease, buy, or finance.
Yeah. Now, I do want to sort of like, in my mind, the whole like buy or finance thing, there's a lot of overlap between those two. But we will get to it. But, it is this is like such a big I know everybody likes to say, oh, it's the, second biggest purchase decision of people's lives and all that. But it's like, it impacts your budgeting from month to month, or, the difference between you buying a smaller vehicle or a bigger one, a used one or a new one. Like there's so much that goes into it. And I understand the anxiety that comes with it. And there's a lot to break down. Now, by no means are, Jodi or I personal finance experts, but what we're here to provide is just a little bit of insight into what each means and also how they might fit your own personality. So we're not going to get into interest rates because those change so much. But we are going to get into the implications of each, stream, if you want to call them that.
Pros and cons.
The pros and cons, and just why one might work if you're a certain kind of person versus the other. So that's kind of the overview of this episode.
And just to kind of kick it off, so the average price for a new car is now over $60,000 across Canada. And that's according to the AutoTrader Price Index for the first quarter of 2025.
It is so painful
how expensive that is. And I was looking, so like 2 years ago, that was in like the 40 to 50 range. So crazy, right?
I remember when DeRosier Automotive Consultants, which is, as the name might suggest, a consultancy that's based here in the GTA, founded by Dennis DeRosier. They're really on top of this stuff, and they put out their market snapshots and this data. And I remember when DeRosier put out the average purchase price, crested $40,000 for the first time, and I was like, wow, that's so much. And now look at it; it's gone up by $20,000 in. I don't know that. I feel like that was maybe like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. And so even the price for a used car average across Canada is $34,000.
Insane. Now, pickup trucks, go figure, they are skewing these numbers for both new and used because they're so many. They're so popular. The F-150 is the best selling vehicle in Canada consistently every single year. So that's obviously going to impact that. But, Kyle Patrick, a friend of ours, another automotive journalist, and we always there's like this joke, like, how much is that? How much do you think that thing is? $60,000. Yeah. Everything's $60,000.
Everything's $60,000.
And so often it happens where we'll look at the price and we're like, oh yeah, it's 59 and change, right? So it's a number that, I don't know, automakers have landed on for minivans and SUVs and luxury cars and pickup trucks, but it's making life very expensive, and it doesn't matter whether you lease or finance. Now, we should kind of take a step back in whatever, like simpler economic times when interest rates were super low. there were cases where I would say to people, you're better off when people are, oh, I'm just going to buy a car outright, which is, that's not easy to do. But I would say to people, well, if you've got 20 grand or 30 grand, but it's 0% interest, you're better off keeping that money, not even, making a down payment. Keep that money in your bank account because you'll make more money off the interest in even a low interest savings account than you will get from putting it down on a car that has 0% financing.
Right.
Nowadays, you've got to be a lot more cognizant of that because interest rates are higher than they were. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, of course, but it does play a role in this decision, in this cycle that people get in with like, okay, I need a new vehicle. What should I do? So first things first, let's outline, what each term means.
Okay, let's start with leasing.
So leasing is you're effectively borrowing the vehicle from the automaker for a predetermined length of time, whether it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. You're paying for the depreciation of that vehicle. So companies, like Canadian Black Book and ALG, they set, the residual values. And that quite literally means how much value is going to be left in that vehicle at a certain point. So an automaker is going to look at a car and let's say it's $60,000. And they are going to say, okay, well, based on condition, age, and mileage, it will be worth $40,000 after 2 years. Let's just say, obviously, guys, these are very arbitrary numbers. I'm just trying to keep it as simple as possible. What you are paying for when you are leasing that vehicle is that $20,000. Plus, obviously, there's a little bit. They've got to make money on it. But you are paying for your term with that vehicle. You are paying to use it for that select amount of time. There are lots of caveats. Like I said, condition matters. So you have to keep the car, you can't have damage. You need to keep it clean. So I wouldn't, if you're a smoker, for example, leasing probably isn't right for you because there are instances where if a car just absolutely reeks and you can't get the smell out, you could end up getting stuck with a hefty bill.
Even if you don't smoke in the car, your car can still stink if you're a smoker.
So it's like you need to take care of the vehicle. There are also mileage caps. So as part of that equation, as part of the calculation for what the residual value is, it's based on how much mileage is on the vehicle. So you might do a 12,000 kilometer annual term or a 24,000. The lower the mileage, so if you sign 6,000 kilometer, again, just these numbers, just making them up as I go. But it's like if you do, let's say a 2-year, 12,000 kilometer lease deal, that means the residual value will be higher. So the vehicle is going to be worth more at the end of your lease term, but it means you have to adhere to that mileage cap because the language in the contract you sign will state there is an overage of 25 cents a kilometer, like whatever the number may be, and it can add up quite quickly. Now, if you go over, sometimes there's a bit of a grace, especially if you are parlaying that into a new lease or new purchase. So if you go over a bit, the dealer or the OEM's finance arm might go, you know what, it's fine. But this is all speculative, right? The residual values are based on guesses, right? These are analysts that are, they're using data from, previous years and whatnot, but they're just guessing. So sometimes the residuals are higher than the OEMs really want, or they're lower, and that's going to jack that lease payment. Of course, there's still interest on top of that as well, but the residuals are such an important tool in setting those lease terms and payments that sometimes if the value is lower than they expect, leasing is no longer as appealing as it once were. Now, to get into leasing, who do I personally think leasing is great for? Somebody who gets really sick and tired of their cars very quickly and easily and just wants something new every year or two, leasing is probably the way to go.
It's the best way to do it because then you're not locked in if you get tired of it, or if you're one of those people who just want like the newest, latest, and greatest stuff. Leasing is a great option for you.
And then you're not, because if you're buying cars that frequently, you're being left with the depreciation. These are depreciating assets no matter what, but the market dictates how much that depreciation is. So if you buy a car and then go to sell it a couple years later, but it's not worth as much as you thought, whereas that residual value when you sign a lease is locked in. So they can't go, oh, you know what? It's actually worth $10,000 less than we thought it was going to be worth. So you need to pony up. That's not how this works. A residual is locked in when you sign that lease agreement, and that's that. So that part is nice. But again, you have to be mindful of your mileage. You have to be mindful of cleanliness, damage, because there are, all of those things come back at the end. And can lead to very expensive. You might get a couple $1,000s worth of charges at the end of your term, and nobody wants that.
No, so there are a couple ways around that. So like if your commute is massive, I wouldn't suggest going for a lease because you're going to surpass your mileage limit pretty easily and end
or
up
you're going to have such a huge mileage cap in your term that the residuals are lower, therefore your lease payment is higher and might be significantly higher than the monthly finance payment would be.
Right. And so I also think there are certain tax benefits if you use a leased vehicle as a business vehicle, or if your work gives you like an allowance, it might work out better for you to do a lease instead of a finance.
Totally. This again is where, talk to your accountant or whatever if you're getting into these kind of details. But that just gives you sort of the overview of what it means in the simplest terms. And why it may or may not be right for you. But yeah, when it comes to those personal finance details or how your work or your contract with your employer could impact this, I would sit down with, your accountant and just say, hey, how does this work for me?
Also, if you prefer a lot more flexibility, I don't think a lease is a great idea. Because if you all of a sudden need to break that lease, you're still liable to have someone else take it over.
Yeah.
And that can be a whole headache to deal with as well. So if you want a bit more flexibility, leasing is really not the way to go.
Yeah. And that's why you see those websites like Lease Busters, right? Where it's like people and sometimes you can get great deals, but that
on the buying end.
Yeah. Because that, the leaseholder is going to have to eat some of that or, pay. They will the terms are always kind of different, right? But it's like they will pay to switch because often it's like, that the lease is in your name. So sometimes you're not allowed to switch it, or there's language in there that there's a financial penalty to switch the leaseholder. So that person, but you can get some good deals on vehicles like that. But leasing it fluctuates a lot, right? Like I said, residuals, that is the number one thing to know. And those update kind of, when a new vehicle comes out or like quarterly or annually, they might reevaluate what they think is going on. During the pandemic, it was actually in the early, if you had, let's say you signed a lease before the pandemic hit and then vehicle values went through the roof, right? Because inventory was down. It was actually really beneficial for people both to either buy out their leases because the residuals were so low and you wouldn't be able to get a comparable vehicle for that money, or that dealers were like, oh, we will pay you to buy that vehicle from you, right? So basically they would go, okay, let's say, again, $60,000 vehicle, the residual is $40,000. So at the end of the lease, the vehicle is worth $40,000. And if you wanted to buy that vehicle outright, you could do so for $40,000. But let's say that used vehicle during the pandemic is now worth $55,000. What some dealers were doing is saying, hey, listen, buy it for the $40,000 and then we will give you a check for $7,500. You sign it right over to us so that you'll make $7,500 and we'll make $7,500 and everybody leaves happy.
Yeah, so there is a universe where you could get a leased car and give it back to them and make money on it, which is I don't know if that's going to happen these days.
No, but that's why it's very like unique circumstances. But those are sort of the kind of nuances of leasing. Financing is very similar. You're going to have a monthly or biweekly or weekly payment, just like you would on a lease term. It's going to be a preset length of time. Although finance terms tend to be longer than leasing because you're paying for the total cost of the vehicle as opposed to just your use to pay for that depreciation.
And plus interest as well.
Yes. So financing is quite literally, you walk into the dealership, see a car you like. Again, we'll use that nice round $60,000. And then they will, if you choose to finance through the dealership, they will, pre-approve you for that financing and tell you, okay, here is what your cost will be. That is the purchase price plus tax plus interest, and then it's broken down into a set number of payments. The benefits, you own the vehicle outright. That's the number one benefit.
Yep.
So especially if you do a reasonable term, length, then there's still money left in that vehicle. So you're driving it without payments, and that's the difference is if you're constantly leasing, you will forever have monthly payments, whereas in a finance situation, that vehicle gets paid off at some point, and then the vehicle, you own it outright. However, the biggest caution I have for people, the two biggest cautions, pay attention to the length of that finance term. If you are getting into these increasingly longer, 84 month, 96 month finance terms, think about how many years that is that you are going to be paying off that vehicle. The other problem with that is if suddenly that vehicle needs to be replaced, but you have what's known as negative equity, you owe more on the vehicle that you're currently paying off than it's worth. You are then going to have to roll that into the next finance that you do. Therefore, if there's still, let's say, 10 grand left on your finance term on that $60,000 vehicle, that just gets tacked on to that $60,000. Therefore, that $60,000 car, you are now paying $70,000 for. And it can create sort of a vicious cycle. The other big thing I warn people about when it comes to financing, always negotiate the total purchase price. And then guys, we all walk around with calculators in our pockets, right? You don't have to be a math whiz. I'm not a math whiz. My brother is the accountant, not me. So what I tell people is negotiate how much that vehicle costs all in, and then bust out your calculator and divide it by how many months or weeks, because that is the number of payments you will have. And then you can look at your, how much that is going to affect your budget. Too often it becomes a negotiating tactic where you might be told, oh, it's only going to cost you $400
bi-weekly or something.
Or, oh, it's $400 a month. Oh, that's not so bad. And then you realize that it's a 96-month term. So I always tell people, do the shortest term that you can comfortably afford, because that is going to get you out of that debt sooner. So when I bought my first car new, I did a 4-year finance. Now, again, interest rates it was 0%. It was a fantastic time to buy a car. It was a little bit of an aggressive, payment plan, but I could make it work. And that way I was out from under that vehicle sooner.
Yeah, and then you had no debt on it at the end,
Exactly.
right? And that's like the safest way to look at stuff is like you don't want to be in debt for perpetuity.
Again, because if that vehicle is suddenly, becomes a problem, right? Let's say it's a damage situation that's like a uninsured cost. Let's say you're out of the warranty period. I don't know. Let's say you were driving like a maniac and you blew the engine. And you're just like, oh man, the car is now 6 years old. And I don't want to replace the engine because it's going to cost $6,000 to do it. But if you still owe thousands of dollars on that car, you're really caught in that situation. Again, negative equity is not what you want. When the car is worth less than you owe on it, that is a huge problem. So that is another one of those reasons why I say be as aggressive with your payments as your budget allows for.
Yeah, and to add on to that, do a down payment as big as you can comfortably afford, because that will reduce the amount of debt you owe on that loan.
Yes, but again, this goes back to that interest rate
Yeah.
discussion, right? Where, if it's really not worth it, if the money if it's in some high interest, high yield, tax-free savings account, it might be better served in your
That's
bank
true.
than it will be, paying off some of that balance.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for me personally, I just hate being in debt.
So do I.
I will always give as much money up front as I can.
I get that for sure. But again, it's just one of those things where it doesn't always, because you have to think, right? If you are looking at a vehicle where sometimes, if you do the math, even putting 10 grand down won't actually reduce your payments that much. Right now, again, look it. I'm going to use the calculator in my pocket, right? So let's just say that you put 10 grand down, right? And you have let's say a 60 month.
60K, okay.
Let's just look at a 60 month lease term, right? That's $166.66 a month. Yeah, that's not insignificant, but it's also not a game-changing.
That's not going to bankrupt you.
Exactly, where it's so if that 10 grand is better served, staying in your TFSA or going into an RRSP, and you can afford that $166 and change a month, then I would say don't put that big down payment down. So that's why I'm this is a very personal decision, but there are benefits, of course, to both. Because you might be in a situation where, 10 grand seems like a nice big number, but it's, again, on a $60,000 vehicle, is it really going to make that much of a dent over a 5-year term?
Right. And I think with financing too, you have a lot more flexibility, because a lot of these loans will give you the option to put a big lump sum towards that, right?
Yeah, and often without penalty.
Yeah.
That's become because obviously with mortgages, there's always a penalty, or there's, no penalty a certain time of the year. Whereas with auto finance, because, as much as it's beneficial for the banks to, make that money off of you through interest and whatnot, they want to limit their risk too, right? And so if you can say, hey, look, I'm just going to pay off that last year because I got a big bonus or inheritance or something like that, that finance division of whatever bank is probably going to say, yeah, go for it, pay it off, because that just mitigates their risk factor. So that, again, is one of those things to keep in mind as you go through that. And then the last, of the three options that I think is the least likely, the least commonly.
Yeah, because it's tough, because it just requires you to have a boatload of cash.
Yeah, is to just buy a vehicle outright. Now, of course, the used market, or if you are just swimming in it, then it's probably fine. But yeah, and it's basically the same thing as finance, only without the debt period. So you're just walking in and saying, I want that vehicle. Now, during the pandemic, there were more cases than I thought there would be of people walking into dealerships and saying, hey, I want to buy that vehicle, and I've got cash because I've got a line of credit, or an inheritance or a bonus or whatever. And dealers were like, no, because for them, it was more beneficial as a business because banks were incentivizing.
Right. They make more money on leasing and financing than they do with cash purchases.
Exactly.
So they might be more willing. I think they might be more willing to negotiate if you do financing or leasing versus cash.
Yeah. So I think I haven't heard, many stories in the last few years of that still being the case. But yeah, during the pandemic, it was no, they're just not incentivized to sell a vehicle like that. But yeah, so if you have, again, going back to that big round number, if you've got 60 grand sitting around, first of all, I applaud you. And second of all, then the benefit is you now own that vehicle outright, no finance division of any bank or automaker standing between you and your vehicle.
You can sell it when you want to.
Exactly. If it starts to give you problems or you need a bigger vehicle, you're not worried about negative equity. Of course, you're still going to be worried about depreciation because that vehicle is not going to be worth as much as you paid for it. I mean, the old saying, right? Oh, it, loses 15% of its value the minute you drive it off the lot. And I mean, yeah,
it's
a depreciating asset. That's what they do. So you'll be stuck with that, but that's about it. So those are the three methods to vehicle ownership.
And I mean, like, what else is there to go over? I think that's it. I think we covered most of it.
Yeah. Just again, it's like I guess we could go back to what we talked about in the last episode, right? Is the whole head versus heart discussion, right? That you need to have with yourself and your partner or family member, whatever, is just, no matter what, once you land on, let's say, this is not universal advice, but what I would recommend is the first thing you should do when you're buying a vehicle, whether it's a luxury purchase or a necessary purchase, you're replacing your car, the first thing you should decide is how you want to pay for it, right? So whether you want to lease or whether you want to finance, to me, that's more fundamental to the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes you might walk into a dealer and they ask you that, and it can be in a sort of aggressive manner. Feel free to tell them you will decide, when and if you get to that stage. But internally, I would say you should have a sense of what you want to do. Now, both lease and finance, they get affected by ups and downs of the economy, of the automotive market, of vehicles, being incentivized at the OEM level, right? So we've seen it recently with EVs where, interest rates were high, EV interest dropped, automakers were financing at subprime levels because they needed to move that inventory. The other thing I will caution is, especially if you're financing or buying a vehicle outright, when you see incentives on a vehicle. So let's say there's an ad online or in the paper, and you see, $10,000 off. It's truck month, and they're offering this great deal. The sort of anecdotal term for that in the industry is like money that's left on the hood. Okay, but don't forget that will affect the residual value of that vehicle. So if a $60,000 vehicle is being incentivized to $50,000, and I'm not talking tax rebates, I'm talking through the OEMs, that vehicle its value is going to be impacted by the fact that you have paid less. And the market is aware of that, the Canadian Black Books and those kind of organizations. So incentives are good.
But nothing is free.
And so it will affect you on the back end with that vehicle value. But again, I would recommend go in with the knowledge of what works for you and your budget and your lifestyle, whether it's lease or finance or buying outright, and then make your move from there and calculate the total purchase price. That's what you're negotiating, not the monthly or weekly or bi-weekly payment, because that's how you get into deeper debt than you had planned.
Yeah, and it's too easy to get seduced by those low numbers.
Yeah, sometimes it's not always beneficial, right? It might seem good, but if it's a 96-month term, you're just under it for so long that vehicle suddenly starts to depreciate at a faster rate than you're able to pay it off, and it just becomes a whole thing. So decide what you want to do, negotiate the total price, and then calculate how many payments. If you're financing, what's most reasonable for you. Try to do the shortest term possible without totally putting yourself, in a situation where you're just like car poor.
Which is what happens. It's a sad reality. It happens a lot.
Yeah.
So I know it's a really complicated topic, but if you have questions about it, feel free to email Dan or I at expert@trader.ca. And before this week's Ask an Expert, here is a message from your friends at AutoTrader. Having trouble finding your perfect car at the perfect price? The answer is AutoTrader. Car prices are dropping across Canada, and AutoTrader has hundreds of thousands of new and used cars to choose from. Get a great deal on your perfect car by visiting AutoTrader today. So today's Ask an Expert comes from Kevin T. from BC.
Hello, Kevin.
And it's regarding episode 76 on EV incentives.
Okay.
So great podcast, Dan and Jodi.
Oh, thanks,
thank
Kevin.
you. I'm also concerned about the future of EVs, especially given Polyever's recent announcement that he intends to scrap the 2035 EV mandate. So he sent this before the election.
Yes. Okay.
So there's obviously a little bit of anxiety here.
Dodged a bullet.
It speaks to the politicizing of the EV issue. How depressing. Next thing I expect from him is that he will announce incentives on horse and buggies and free oats if you tie up at church every Sunday. That's so funny. It doesn't make sense for Canadians as a whole. I envy the Nordics.
Yeah. Is that was the end?
No,
of it?
there's more.
Oh, okay.
There's way more. I've sent this link to this podcast to my EV, not quite dumbass, but depressingly non-critical thinking friends and relatives. Not that it will change anything because people get entrenched and tune me out. But I'll never look back from my EV purchase nor the solar panels I put on my roof because incentives do work. I now drive and power my house for free. That is until the panels are paid off in 8 years. That's pretty cool. So I've owned my R1T, so that's a Rivian, for 1.5 years.
Okay.
And drove it 40K, including a trip across Canada and back last summer. That's pretty cool. Wow. What a fantastic vehicle and ownership experience. The gear tunnel. What an innovation.
I think Kevin and I could be friends.
I feel like he's angling for a buddy here. I'd never go back to gas or diesel due to stinky fumes, expensive maintenance, fueling costs, rapid depreciation, now that I've experienced the joy of charging at home. I completely agree with all your concerns about EV adoption, i.e. the inferior network. Although we are comparatively blessed in BC compared to Northern Ontario and Nova Scotia. Actually, he writes Ontario.
That's hilarious.
Which is not a
yeah.
typo. I think that was intentional.
But BC does have a great
way better than we have it here.
So he is in kind of, even though Quebec, now the money's run out, but had higher incentives and had a really high adoption rate, BC as a whole did a better job of, putting the infrastructure in place for people like Kevin to own and have their EVs make sense.
And it seems like he's really made it work for him and not the other way around. There's just one sentence left. So I enjoy spending $11 charging my battery at home versus the $130 in my beloved Tacoma.
There you go.
So EVs aren't for everyone, just most people. Keep up the great work, you two, and happy motoring from BC.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I mean, first of all, I always love, when like a very reasonable person comes on and doesn't, because the opposite is often true, right? You do get a lot of, fist shaking. People are angry and hate EVs, but then you have that pro EV faction that gets just as angry and says, well, they're just dumb and they don't get it. But it's nice when you're so sensible and reasonable in your approach and explain it and articulate it very well to say.
He's hitting us with some facts here and some numbers.
And from his own experience, which is great, right? It's funny that he road tripped his R1T across Canada because I actually saw just a couple weeks ago an R1T in Toronto on BC plates that had very obviously, like, it was loaded with gear and like they had very obviously were doing the same thing as Kevin. And I was thinking like, wow, that's a huge trip. B, to do it in an EV is impressive.
That's an extra challenge for sure.
Yeah. So, it's cool to see that Kevin's not the only one that's kind of spreading the good word about EVs with his R1T.
I mean, I love what he's doing here. So first of all, he's using it a lot, which is so nice to see. But also the fact that he's not paying for electricity is incredible to me.
Yeah, that's and I mean that's kind of the thing, right? I do, as much as I get the concerns, although I don't really think people are that concerned, but going like, oh well, what about the grid? We're gonna need more. It's like, yes, we are gonna need more electricity. The nice thing in Canada is like we are such a great producer of clean energy, right? So
Hydro.
hydro in Ontario and Quebec and, into BC, like Alberta, not so much, but coal has been all but eliminated around here. And you do have a lot of wind and solar and nuclear, and it is just like that much better for, it lowers the environmental impact of everyday driving. We need more capacity as electric vehicles become the thing. But it's also not an excuse. Again, like I said earlier, or maybe it was the last episode, talking about, we shouldn't have to clean up our act until that other person does. It's like, well, that's not like, that puts us in a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
Right? To me, it's like, to say, we need more capacity if we're going to have more EVs. Therefore, let's just keep doing what we're doing. It's like, okay, but we know what we're doing is very damaging to the future.
Right.
So it's not a good excuse to keep doing it.
But I mean, even he took it kind of into his own hands. Yeah. It's like he doesn't want to put the strain on the grid, so he put in solar panels. Yeah. Like that's a great solution to this problem, right? And they were incentivized.
Yeah, totally.
So I think like that seems like a win-win to me.
Yeah. Well, cool. Kevin, thanks for sharing. You sound like a very smart and pretty cool guy, to be honest. Cool truck. You know what to do with that tunnel down the middle.
I mean, tell us what kind of beer. I'm sure Dan's really interested in what kind of beer you're putting in the beer tunnel.
And how the R1, I would really like to know how the R1T is. I'm just going to assume that Kevin might be a mountain biking kind of guy. Because I wonder what it's like to live with bikes. I know I've seen people with crossbars across the bed, but I've never actually seen a bike like attached to that like a rack mounted onto that. But anyways, yeah, if you feel like writing us again, please feel free, expert@trader.ca.
You got it right this time. Wow. This is the first time in history. Anyway, thank you so much, Kevin, for your question. That wraps up this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Drive safe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.